Good morning and welcome to the June 26, 2019 Left 2 Board. I'd like to call it to order, and our first order of business will be taking a moment of silence to remember our fallen brothers and sisters in the police and fire world, as well as our brothers and sisters in the military. Thank you. So looking at our agenda, first action for our board is the approval of our minutes from May 15, 2019.
Second.
Motion has been made and seconded to adopt the minutes as presented. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. And for the record, we have A.J. Johnson on the phone. Is that correct?
Yep.
And that's the only one, correct, Steve?
Yes.
And we have a quorum is present, and so through it. All right, our item number 2, which is supplemental rate preview. No action required by the board, and I'll turn over to Steve.
Yeah. Tim, you're aware. As you're aware, there was legislation passed last session that had a fiscal note from the state actuary's office identifying a supplemental rate impact. The supplemental rates for those types of bills are adopted by the board. You'll be doing that adoption or taking action on that next month, but Tim is here to talk to you about the different options. And again, by way of reminder, Tim and I will be doing all the presentations today. So discussion is highly encouraged to kind of keep things from sounding too familiar. But with that, I'll turn it over to Tim for this first presentation.
Thank you, Steve. For the record, Tim Valencia, Deputy Director for the Left 2 Board. This is the supplemental rate preview presentation. So as Steve mentioned, at issue is that a supplemental rate may need to be adopted by the board due to the passage of House Bill 1913, which is related to the occupational disease presumption. This bill added some conditions to the occupational disease presumption. It extends the presumption to certain publicly employed firefighters, investigators, and law enforcement. It addresses the qualifying medical examination, and it also creates an advisory committee which will be able to study or has been charged with studying these types of requests in the future, so things that would affect the legislation, particularly looking at the medical research to determine what may or may not be appropriate to the presumption. So about supplemental rates. This is part of the fundamental duty of the board, which is, of course, to adopt contribution rates to be able to pay for the benefits within the plan. Supplemental rates are a temporary rate increase, which are intended to pre-fund the cost of benefit improvements not in the basic rate. And this occurs in this situation when a piece of legislation that is passed. The current rates that have been adopted are already covering the existing benefits. We've now added a new benefit, so there's no contributions coming in to pay for the liabilities of that particular benefit improvement. So a supplemental rate helps to pre-fund that time when the rates aren't being covered, so it's a temporary increase. And then when you go into your next rate setting cycle, then this benefit improvement will be the liabilities there, and it'll be rolled into the rate setting process, and then that will become part of the main rate. Because of this temporary nature, usually the rates, which are determined for each individual bill, the supplementals they're usually adopted by the board in July, and they are usually for an effective date of September 1. Part of this mechanism is that DRS is required to give employers 30 days notice of any change in the contribution rate. So by adopting in July, there's time to give notice to employers for the rates to be effective September 1. In calculating or in developing the supplemental rate, OSA actually does all the fiscal notes for pension legislation, which of course we refer to as the fiscal notes. Notably, not all benefit improvements do have or cause an increase in contribution rates. Doesn't necessarily mean they don't have costs, but those costs may not be sufficient to create a rate increase. The assumptions that OSA uses in calculating a fiscal note may be different from those used in the underlying plan. Depends on the nature of the particular increase and the assumptions there and that they have to use to calculate the information about the benefit payments and what experience the plan may face. Again, the contributions that they're calculating are intended to offset any liabilities created by the new benefit improvement. The last note that I'll make is that when the OSA does their fiscal note, they're calculating the fiscal note based on the underlying statutory rate, which is they're required to follow, which is the aggregate rate, which we talked about, rather than the board funding policy, although that is can be found within the note itself. But the note itself is calculated under the aggregate rate, as I'll show you. So the board has looked at supplemental rate increases for 15 benefit improvements dating back to 2003. So we have looked at them, the possibility of supplemental rates on several occasions. The board has not always adopted the supplemental rate. As you can see, there are 10 improvements of the 15 for which they have adopted rates. Most of those were during earlier periods of the board's work when they were implementing their rate stability policy and bringing the rates up through, which pretty much stabilized around 2008, 2009. But as you can see, for the most part, those rates were adopted in July, other than a couple of circumstances, and almost always effective in September, as I mentioned. But there have been a few times or occasions where they have not adopted the supplemental rate, specifically 5 different bills spanning between 2010 and 2018. There's been 2 primary we'll call them justifications for not adopting the rate. In one case, it was determined that the existing rates that were already in place were enough to cover the funding requirement that was represented by the supplemental itself. So that occurred both on the bills that we were looking at in 2018 and in 2010. 2 other times, it was determined that we would just absorb the costs through the plan experience. And as I recall those discussions, it was, I'll call it, there was a certain level of uncertainty about how much they would actually cost. We just didn't have the information to determine, with a level of certainty whether or not these costs would emerge as predicted. So the determination was at that level, and given the rates that were in place, that we would just absorb the costs and let them emerge naturally in the plan experience. So on to this specific fiscal note then for House Bill 1913. The reason this bill does create a cost, it doesn't predict more deaths or more disabilities. So it's not an increase in total numbers. Rather, the costs are generated from more of the disabilities being eligible for duty-related benefits rather than non-duty related benefits, and the non-duty benefits being more generous are more costly. So that's really where the underlying cost comes for on this particular bill. Again, this fiscal note was calculated under the aggregate cost method, but I will also show you the entry age normal cost, which is following the board's current policy. So on the left is the calculation in the fiscal note under the aggregate method. As you can see, the impact on the rates, assuming effective 9/1/2019, 0.05 for the member, 0.03 for the employer, and 0.02 for the state. Very similar to what we typically see on supplemental rates. And below that, you can see the actual financial costs in the for the current for the 1921 biennium, 21-23 biennium, and then the 25-year projection for the general fund with the state contribution, the local government employers, with a total employer rate of cost of $2 million in the next biennium, 2.1 in the following, and $39 million over the 25-year. On the right, upper right, is the cost under the board's funding policy under the entry age normal cost. You can see the numbers are they're very comparable, but just slightly less than under the aggregate cost, and thereby the budget impact would be just slightly less as well. So 0.04, 0.02, and 0.02 by comparison. And then I noted down in the bottom right what I'll call the current contribution rates. It's actually effective coming July 1st. The rates will be adjusted as shown on the screen: 8.59 for the member, 5.15 for the employer, and 3.44 for the state. That was a decision the board made last year and adopted this new rate level for the 1921 biennium and 21-23 biennium. And so in effect, this represents the three different options that you'll have to consider next month, which be adopting a supplemental under the aggregate rate, adopting a supplemental under the entry age normal following the board's policy, or not adopting a supplemental and letting the experience be absorbed or the cost being absorbed through the experience of the plan. Now, it is the board's and has been the board's practice to have any fiscal notes audited by an outside actuary. Now, it's only for bills that are passed with a cost. The board has a longstanding relationship with Marilyn Oliver at Bartell and Associates, who we've retained to do audits, and she has done a large majority of the audits for fiscal notes for the board. She has been working on this for the last month or so, and we will have the results by letter from Marilyn to be provided to you at the July 24th meeting. So finally, where this takes us then. So, of course, Marilyn Oliver will finish her work and provide us a letter with the results of her audit for the July 24th meeting. We will present you options at the July 4th meeting, and that's where you will have the question of whether or not you will adopt a supplemental contribution rate. So that's all my formal remarks. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to address them.
Any questions for Tim? Straightforward. Thank you. Mr. Nelson.
Move around to the front there for my presentations today, so forgive me while I shuffle back and forth throughout the meeting. Okay. We don't have a PowerPoint for this presentation, so what we'll be working off of is in your materials, there is an interim work plan draft. And I will speak to some high-level pieces, then go into some of the specifics, and then answer questions that you have. So in the preview that we did for the board last month, of all the actuarial topics, all of the potential benefit change topics, and all of the administrative topics, we went back and took your feedback from that last meeting and put together sort of our best guess at a draft work plan of what it would look like for this interim. And then that'll be based on some of the decisions that you make today. So for instance, with respect to the actuarial items, those are all in there. They're all required. The study that's required by the legislature related to tribal membership is in there. Two of the items, one that was worked on with the select committee last year, the month of death issue that went to legislation but didn't pass out of the legislature last session. The Select Committee has decided to continue that issue forward again this interim. So we put it, since it will apply to all the plans, including Left 2, it's on this draft work plan. The other issue that's on the draft work plan is interrupted military service. I'll be doing an initial presentation actually on that topic later on this meeting. That's a change that affects a number of members today, and it can affect their benefit. I won't go into the details, but right now, but essentially the federal government has made some changes, and so in order for Left 2 members to receive the interrupted military benefits that they are already entitled to under statute, we're going to have to make some statutory changes. It's not quite a technical correction, and I'll talk about that later, but that issue is built into this work plan. The Select Committee is considering whether they're going to work on it as well, or whether they're just going to let the Left 2 board take the lead on it and then add in the other plans during session. We'll keep you updated throughout the interim as far as the progress of that particular topic. Then there were two other issues. One, they're both ones that you've heard in the past, some more recent past, some further back. One had to do with the window for allowing members to change their retirement option. That was an issue that the board heard several times last interim, decided not to pursue legislation on this last session. It's something that the board will communicate to the Select Committee, since again this is a topic policy-wise that could apply to all the plans, and see if they have interest in coordinating. In this draft work plan, we do have the survivor option election built in. Because that's an issue, again, that the board has already had a number of hearings on, that's one that doesn't have the same workload impact as perhaps a brand new issue, for instance, or one that hasn't been discussed in several years. Another issue from last month's discussion that I wanted to mention is standby pay as basic salary. So that is an issue that the board has heard a number of times in the past, but not the recent past. And since when Ryan, last interim, you put that on the agenda for possible discussion this interim, and when Ryan brought up that topic, there was questions and interest in learning more, at the very least learning more about that issue. So we have at least an initial presentation on that topic scheduled for September. And then it'd be, at that point in time, it would give you, once you have all those kind of basic questions answered, you'd have a better idea whether or not you want to get more into the nuts and bolts and potentially pursue legislation on that. Administrative topics, again, the key one that's kind of a variable that I want to highlight for this interim is the move. So the way the move process works is, again, we've been told by SIB, they gave us our 1-year notice, so we will be vacating out of this building. Because of the time frame involved, there's what's called an emergency process. But even an emergency process, as you might well expect, can take a long time going through the state processes. So the first piece of that was to submit a request to OFM, which did go out for an emergency move approval. There was some analysis of what our needs are and what our desire, some of the preferences for the new location. Until that emergency request has been reviewed and approved, we can't do anything. So the people that work with us for real estate, and for instance, they can't do any searching or any of that kind of work until that's approved. Once that's approved, then they'll be able to help us. Informally, we can still look at things on our own. For instance, Jessica has done some work identifying some potential places so that once we get the approval, we can immediately talk to our real estate people and say, well, what about this and what about that, and get more detail from them than we can on our own. The hope is that process, that the move will be completed this interim so that we're not doing it during session. In a perfect world, we do it during the month of August, which, when there's not a board meeting scheduled, the world is not perfect, and the idea that we'll have everything that we need approved by August is probably, wishful thinking. You're right. I should be more clear about whether I'm thinking 2019 or 2020 when I say August. So, but we will keep you apprised. That could impact some of this stuff. Tim and I have went through a lot of discussion. There is a lot on this agenda, this draft work plan for you. But we're confident that it's a reasonable work plan. Many of the topics that are on here, the Office of the State Actuary is going to be helping out. Jacob is very capable, so he'll be picking up some of the slack from having one position vacant. Tim and I have both done research stuff in the past, so we can help out as required as well. And then I'm working on the recruitment to fill that spot. Some of that I'll talk about a little bit more when we have the budget update later, some of the challenges there. But, again, this work plan does include sort of all those expected topics. Some of the topics, and this is where we need feedback from you. So some of the topics that the board identified last interim that you didn't want to work on last interim, but maybe this interim, and then when Ryan was doing his presentation, there didn't seem to be the same interest in those topics as others. We kind of left those out. So this is a chance for you to look at this draft agenda and see. So for instance, that'd be issues like return to work, or the issue dealing with members who are injured or killed performing their services out of state, like the firefighters and law enforcement officers, for instance, that were responding to the shooting in Las Vegas. If they had been injured or killed, they would be outside of L&I and duty-related benefits. There's a couple of other DRS issues that the board had looked at the year before last. Those issues either weren't affecting members today or weren't affecting members' benefits today, or didn't have quite the same urgency as some of these other potential issues or newer issues. So we were trying to, in coming up with this draft for you to consider, those are the kind of judgment calls, if you will, we need your input on to either validate or correct as you see fit. With that, I will throw it open for any questions that you have, and I apologize, I don't have in front of me a list of all the topics that were on the preview from last month.
Any questions?
Sure. Just, Steve, I think you mentioned it before, and I know we're being asked to find new residents for your offices. And I remember if we're in this building, we can use this room. How are we being ousted from this room for our annual or our monthly meetings?
That's undecided.
Okay.
I brought that question up with the director for the SIB, and the SIB does have a policy that only people who are in the building can use the conference room. That's partly for security reasons.
Understood.
So, but the request to perhaps make an exception to that policy to allow the board to continue to use this is something that she said she would consider.
Former members of the investment board, would that help?
It depends on whether they're in good standing or not.
I think they were when they left, but those days are weaning. So.
Second
Yes.
that.
Yeah. So, and for instance, I know there's a firefighter on the State Investment Board as well, and there are representatives from the Senate and the House. To the extent that you are comfortable reaching out to your representatives on the SIB or your contacts within the agency itself, and reminding them that, you know, we are leaving, but we would like to use, to continue to use the boardroom if possible, and would they give consideration to an exception? I think that would be appreciated.
I would. I will. I'll work with you. I'm not sure if I want to step out into that role. We'll talk to our rep on the board. But on the other hand, if you would like me to meet with the director, I'd like to go through you if we're going to do that. I don't want to step out and freelance.
No, I appreciate that.
And I'm looking at I was thinking about some of the other rooms that we have within the government to meet like this, and this room kind of fits the people that we have here.
It has been well suited. We'll look at options. There's a cost if we have to use other options, but there could also be pros and cons. So, for instance, if we might have to change the meeting dates, the historical meeting dates, but we could get a conference room, one of the legislative hearing rooms, for instance, which then might allow them to be televised by TVW. Again, pros and cons. So there's all of those different types of issues that we'll have to get sorted out as part of the move. But, and this use of this conference room is definitely one of those issues.
On the building relocation, was there any consideration, or have you had that conversation with anyone regarding a site that would have a building or a meeting room of this size for us for our own personal use?
There are some buildings out there that do have shared conference room facilities and shared, whether they would be sufficient for a board meeting, we won't know until we get a chance to actually dig into them. That's one of those kind of details that once our request is in process with OFM, we'll be able to do a little bit more digging on that. For instance, I'm told that the Helen Summers building and the new GA building, or at least the new GA building, has a beautiful boardroom. But I'm also told that that building has no vacancy. So that would be something we'd have to confirm with with our real estate folks once we're able to work with them.
Other questions? All right, thank you, Steve. Stay
So
there.
some of the issues that were not included, I mentioned career change, the annuity minimum benefit. That was one that came up. The legislature passed annuities for all the plans last session, and the minimum purchase was different from what it is, lower than what it is for Left 2, but we haven't heard any complaints from members about the minimum purchase being too high. The two DRS issues that I mentioned, specifically what those were, there's one where disabled members returning to work. When they're eligible to return to work, the employer is required to hire them back, and DRS kicks them off of their disability retirement. But if DRS determines that they're able to return to work and the employer disagrees with that, then the member can be in limbo in terms of, do I get my pension or not? DRS has decided that while they're in that appeal process, they will continue to receive their pension. So that's not an issue that's affecting anybody's benefits. PEB coverage for catastrophic disability retirees. All catastrophic disability retirees have their medical insurance reimbursed from the fund, but they have to find it on their own, and depending on where they live, their options can be various. For surviving spouses, they are guaranteed access to the PEB plan, and so the idea was by moving all the catastrophic retirees into PEB, they'd have that same sort of level benefit. Everybody gets the same thing, plus they would have access no matter where they're at. But again, that's an issue. Some of them might have slightly better benefits than what PEB would offer, and so it might be seen as a win or a loss. There's pros and cons. That issue you talked about in the past, so that is not on this agenda. The only actuarial issue that wasn't required, but we can, depending on how things go, the CPI that's used for COLAs. This, it's referenced in a technical way in some plans. For instance, in the State Patrol plan, it's specifically referenced as Seattle, Tacoma, Bremerton. But the federal government recently made some changes in their indexes, and they don't do Seattle, Tacoma, Bremerton anymore. They do Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue. For the other plans like Left 2, the statute is more generic, and it says Seattle area. And DRS has used Seattle, Tacoma, Bremerton by WAC to meet the Seattle area, and they plan on using Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue moving forward. So that's an issue where, again, we didn't feel like there's already a solution in place, to the extent that there were a lot of questions around that, which there haven't been. We could maybe add in a briefing, but we didn't put that on there. And then we left off the discussion on the administrative topics also of meeting delivery alternatives, like TVW, for instance, because some of that's going to be determined based on if we end up changing locations. Now, again, that was a lot, but I'd be happy to answer questions that you have about any of the particular topics that were included or not included in the draft work plan.
Ade.
Just for the benefit of people that are watching or listening, this interim work plan is to be able to accommodate the changes that we're going through this year, which is moving, and of course, reduction in staff due to Ryan departure. So there's still some items that we want to deal with, but keeping in mind those two major issues, we cannot get to them.
Yes, that's a good point. To the extent that you guys want to add some topics to the agenda, then I would respectfully suggest that you drop something else off so that we're not adding to it. We're kind of maybe moving things around. I do feel like we can do all of the items on this draft work plan and meet the standards that we have for providing information to you. But given some of the points that you mentioned, Ade, the move and the temporary vacancy in Ryan's spot, this is going to be a tight interim to add a lot of additional workload on. So if there's something that could perhaps wait until next interim, when we'll be rolling at full speed or better again, then I would appreciate that consideration.
Ade, go ahead.
I'll just, when we're talking about the move, I'd just like to suggest too that we consider parking, so that some of our members that come here, I think a lot of people are probably getting used to free parking. I think when parking become expensive, that may reduce participation on the part of some of our members and maybe the access to the building. But of course, we don't know what is out there. But I'm hoping that we will be able to keep in mind some of those things to be able, I think, having people come to listen, and for some of us, I think that makes it very.
That's
makes
an
a
excellent,
difference.
that's an excellent point. And we will make sure that we include that in our considerations for the move. Thank you.
So the interim plans before you, we were looking for a motion to adopt as presented.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded to adopt the interim work plan. Further discussion? Mark?
So, just for the board's consideration, I think it may be, so I guess technically I'm speaking against the motion, and I'll tell you why. When it comes to the disabled members returning to work, I think that that is an important issue for us to consider. Although at this point, it seems as though it's not affecting anybody with the DRS's interpretation of how that works. It bothers me that an employer can object and potentially leave a member out of their benefit. But since the DRS is already determined, or they're managing that to the favor potentially of a member, I don't think it's not necessarily an issue for us. I would say that suggest that the PEB coverage is critical, and in terms of I think that's important, and I understand the workload is a serious issue for the staff. So from my perspective, I would like to see the PEB coverage on there, and my perspective is that we could replace the standby pay as basic salary as an issue. So.
Been easier if you just amended the motion.
So.
We have a motion to adopt. If it suits everyone, you'd make a motion to add the PEB.
So I could make an amendment.
Amendment, yeah.
If an amendment's in order.
Yeah, the discussion we had earlier was that if we were going to add something to it, we would need to probably look to take something off.
Yes, right.
Yeah,
So, yes.
Okay, so
So I could make it, if an amendment's in order, I'd be willing to make an amendment.
Would that be
That
proper?
for the, okay, so for the interim work,
Okay,
okay. Well,
so on the amendment, we would add the PEB coverage and strike standby pay as a basic salary,
yes.
Okay. Discussion on the amendment. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, so we have a motion now to adopt the interim work plan with PEB coverage in place of standby pay as basic salary. Any other discussion?
I think it's a good idea. So I speak in favor of it.
Well, thank you. On the motion. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
There you go. All right, Mr. Nelson, that was the interim work plan, has been adopted by the board. We're under item number 4, which is the benefit improvement account.
Well,
I think it's just an update.
Yes, and I appreciate the discussion on this topic. As we go through these things, the more that you guys discuss these, it really helps us understand where your priorities are. Now, with respect to the benefit improvement account, we are, this presentation is a little bit of background, and again, reminding you of sort of what the process is going to look like going forward. And again, I was a little bit optimistic. So you'll see the first bullet says the legislature transferred. No, they authorized it, but the transfer has not yet taken place. As soon as that actual transfer has taken place, it can only for record-keeping purposes, you can only move money in and out of the CTF 1 day a month. It might happen at the end of this month, but it's looking probably more like it will not. But we'll keep you updated as far as when that transfer has happened. The next step in sort of, well, what happens once it's in there? Before before any benefit improvement that's going to use the benefit improvement account, the legislature is looking for a recommendation from the Left 2 board. So it's going to take legislation. Technically, they could do it without you, but they're going to be looking for your guidance on what benefit improvement to fund with the benefit improvement account, and the idea that hopefully that it would be like agency request legislation. I think most legislators, that's sort of their plan A. They don't want a scenario where different groups are in lobbying for different ideas on how to spend that money, especially if they're conflicting ideas on how to spend the money. So, again, very brief background. The account was created in 2008, and one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up is the intent. There was some intent language at that time that talked about the nature of what was the benefit improvement account intended to accomplish. And that policy goal recognized that although you have an age 53 retirement, a 2% per year multiplier means that it's very difficult due to the nature of your work for you to work 30 years, 35 years to get to that 60 or 70% income replacement ratio that most experts kind of see as the floor for retirement, the goal for retirement, the bottom of the range for the goal for retirement is at 60 to 70%. Firefighters, again, you've heard this before, over 90% of firefighters do not participate in Social Security. So again, the importance of that pension making up that 60 to 70%. The benefit improvement account was intended to kind of help manage that difference between reality and expectations, make it more possible, reasonable, that a Left 2 member could retire after a 25-year career and still somehow get to that 60% at the very least. So that was the intent of the benefit improvement account. Now, the benefit improvement account, though, was originally intended to be funded out of general state revenue. And there was a schedule that was ramped up. This is the full amount, but that also includes the amount that was going to employers. So on this slide, actually, half of that amount is what would be going to the benefit improvement account that we're talking about today. As it turned out, the actual payments did not match the expectations at all. So there were some years where you didn't hit the trigger. There were times where you did hit the trigger, but no funds were appropriated. And then to the extent that money has been transferred or at some point in time will be transferred into the benefit improvement account, none of that came from the state general fund. It all came from the Left Plan 2 fund, which we'll get into later. Then does the source of the funding now kind of change or affect the way you view the goals, the original goal of the benefit improvement account? All future transfers have been eliminated. So to the extent that you are considering what to do with the benefit improvement account, it will continue to, it's in the commingled trust fund. It will continue to receive earnings or losses based on whatever the returns are for the commingled trust fund. But there is no expectation for future payments into the account, either from the general fund or from the Left Plan 2 fund. All obligations now have been satisfied.
Steve, and we've talked about this before, but my question is on the 50 million. They transferred 300 million from the left to
Yes.
or they're going to,
Yes.
but there's still an outstanding 50 million that the legislature owed us for that fund. Why can't we go into them and have them transfer another 50 million out of left into the benefit enhancement to take care of that other 50 million that was supposed to be in there for the last 7 years?
The way the calculations were done, the state actuary did a report to the board last year, and identified what sort of the present day value of all of those future payments into the benefit improvement account would be. And if you took the present day value of all of those future payments, plus the 25 million that was owed for this upcoming September because the trigger had been met, plus the 25 million that was owing from the last payment and interest on that one from 2 years ago, that total adds up to about 191 million. So with the 300 million, the thinking was that does satisfy all of the past payments and the future payments, plus some. That was the legislative thinking, if you will, because there was some discussion about actually using that 191 number. But then in the negotiations, it was like, no, depending on your assumptions about how often the trigger would be met in the future, the number might be higher than 191. And they ended up landing on 300.
Are there still in the future options of transferring other left to monies into the benefit enhancement account, improvement account?
If there were, it would take another bill. So
It would
under
take another bill.
under existing law, there are
There's no administrative way of doing it. Okay.
there's no expectations or no future obligations at all.
300 million is a good start, though. Really, absolutely, really does work well. Thank you.
And I think, let me see what we've got here. This is the May 31st, that original 16+ million that had been transferred a while back to satisfy the first couple payments plus interest on those has grown. So as of the end of May, the balance was 21 million. So once the 300 goes in there, you'll be looking at a total of a little over 321. And again, it'll be increasing or decreasing depending on the investment returns. Now, there are some limits on that spending. Again, I mentioned it has to be whatever benefit improvement is paid for, it has to be adopted by the legislature. And then in the original benefit improvement account, there was also a limit that the transfer has to be sufficient to offset the full expected cost of the benefit improvement. And so to use that what that means, we are used to thinking of and talking to you about benefit improvements in the same way as like you pay for a house with a mortgage. So you have a benefit improvement and you pay for it with a contribution rate increase. Each month you make a monthly contribution to pay that benefit. But theoretically, if you were looking to buy a $300,000 house and you had $300,000 in cash, you could just buy the house with no mortgage. And so it's the same way, to the extent that the present day value of the benefit improvement is that's what the actuary will be looking at and comparing to what the costs are. If that's, depending on the type of benefit improvement, that may mean the plan is taking on some risk, that the benefit costs actually exceed what the transfer amount is. But that'll be discussions for a future day. I just want to give you a heads up that that is one of the issues that we'll be working on with you as part of any benefit discussion, is what is that present day value or that cost of it, and how does that compare to what's in the account?
Jeff?
Just a commentary, maybe you could just follow up and comment on some of my thoughts. This is interesting because this provides a vehicle to do what a 790 originally tasked us as one of the requirements or the goals of the board when we established this a long time ago to do was improve benefits for members. And to take that out of and accomplish what we were tasked to accomplish, and take that money out of the actual trust fund to do something like that would have been looked at with an absolute a skeptical eye. Even though our funding status is great, and some of the things we've done to actually, to make sure, even all the way through the 8 to 11, mess that everybody else seemed to succumb to, that we skated above just because of our funding status. So what this does, as a matter of expectations, this allows us the ability to do what we were originally tasked to do, and do it because that's the only purpose this fund can be used for. So allocating money from the actual general fund, the account trust fund, into this account here allows us to do what we're supposed to be doing as a fiduciary anyway, which is kind of interesting. It provides us a freedom to accomplish that. Steve, would you take like 30 seconds? And this is all about managing expectations, because somebody's going to listen to this meeting afterwards and go, oh my God, $300 million. That's a lot of money. What are we going to get? We're going to get medical. We're going to get, there are marquee benefits that we find out are unobtainium because the true cost out there is so far beyond what anybody expects when the actuary gets done, what the true cost projection will be. That just to manage expectations when somebody does listen to this, well, potentially the impact of $300+ million prospectively or system-wide on that just comes nowhere near the cost of any of the marquee benefits out there we're talking about here. So we need to craft this very carefully.
Yeah.
Can you address that?
No, that's an excellent point. And managing expectations around this account will be one of the challenges. So thank you for bringing that up and giving me a chance to kind of talk about it. There are at least initially sort of three different broad paths in my mind that you could go down, depending on what your goals are for this account distribution, if you will. I mentioned earlier the plan, the initial intent for the benefit improvement account was to boost your the base benefit so that members wouldn't necessarily have to work 30 or 35 years in order to get to 60 or 70% of pay. The type of benefit that would accomplish that goal would be a multiplier increase. Now, when you do a multiplier increase, though, is also probably the most expensive type of benefit improvement that you can do, particularly if it's retroactive. Now, if it was prospective only, then you might be talking about a multiplier increase from, say, 2% to possibly 2.1% based on some of the pricing that's been done in the past. Maybe not even quite that, but that's what you'd be looking at. That would apply to all service. If you do it retroactive, the cost for a defined benefit improvement ramps up substantially, particularly if you include retirees. And the reason is, if you're retired, you're going to see that benefit immediately. It's going to be on your next check. You know, at the end of the month, you'll see that improvement, and you'll see it every month for the rest of your life. If you're close to the end of your career, you won't see it immediately, but you'll still see that improvement in a year or two. Whereas if you're an average member, it might be 10 or 15 years before you ever start seeing that benefit improvement. So that question of retroactivity ends up becoming huge when you start talking about the cost of it. A second goal might be that in classic terms, employers offer pension plans as a kind of deferred compensation for the purpose of recruiting and retaining employees. And so you might design a benefit improvement to help recruit or retain employees. There was one of the benefits, for instance, that's been priced by the board in the past was a multiplier increase for years 16 through 25. That way, part of that was to manage costs. So somebody who's works 5 years is not getting a multiplier increase, and then they leave, they never benefit from that. Somebody who's got 15 years on, now they've got an incentive to continue in the plan and continue working in Washington. So it might have that retention incentive for those, and at the same time help out on the other goal of getting you up to the 60 or 70%. That's an example. Again, defined benefit improvement, pricey, not as pricey as a just flat multiplier increase. You might be able to increase with the $300 million. For instance, you might see a multiplier increase of to 2.2% per year for years 16 through 25. That'd be prospective only. Again, if you did it retroactive, the costs increase dramatically. When you, guys who've already got 25 years on the job, they've already qualified, they'll start seeing it as soon as they retire. Members who are already retired, if they had more than 15 years, more than 25 years, would also see that improvement immediately. So the cost goes up, so the scale of the increase would have to drop down to stay within the $320 million budget. The third kind of general approach that you can consider is if the source of the funds. So the benefit improvement account policies were originally adopted with the idea that they were going to be funded from the state general fund, and they weren't. They were funded from the plan. The plan funding came from contributions and the earnings on those contributions. Those contributions were made by the members, the employers, and the state. So to the extent then you might say, well, then our goal would be to distribute that the account, the benefit improvement account, in such a way that it fairly represents the contributions that were made by everybody to the plan. And that would include career employees, those who are nearing the end, and it would include retirees as well, because they've contributed into the plan. That type of, then if you go down that path, then we'd come up with different options. You might end up different from a benefit improvement. One of the things that's been talked about, for instance, when they were talking about distributing money to left one retirees as part of merger, that was in the form of a 13th check. You could potentially do something like that for retirees. You might want to give them a chance to manage the tax impact a little bit better, though, And if you're going to do a distribution, just have it go into like a 457 account for all the members and retirees, and then there's no immediate tax hit, and those would be the kind of options that we would develop for your consideration. But first is sort of getting some general agreement on what are you trying to accomplish with this? Are you trying to make an improvement for future members? Are you trying to recognize past members? Are you trying to do both, even with the understanding that that'll be a very incremental increase? That'll be kind of the next step that we'll be working with you on, is some of those goals. And all of the organizations that represent Left 2 members will be working on that same kind of question now. The benefit improvement account has already come up at the annual meeting for WACOPS and the annual meeting for the State Council of Fire. And I'm sure it's being discussed with other organizations as well. Those policy questions will probably get sorted out first, and then if there's agreement on what that policy is, then the different options to get there will kind of flow from that, and that'll be the same process that we plan on working with you guys on. What are the different policy options? And then if you have decided on where you want to focus your attention, then we can bring you some more specific ideas related to accomplishing that goal. And that's part of the plan for, spoiler alert, that's the plan for some of the discussions on benefit improvement account here at the Left 2 board for this interim, particularly depending on how things go at the strategic planning meeting. Ideally, if it was a perfect world and agreement comes quickly and options can be developed quickly, then you could theoretically be prepared to recommend legislation for next session. That would take everything, all the planets having to kind of align in a fairly short amount of time for something like that to happen. Doable, not impossible, but difficult.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to be clear, we're not even in the right universe with the amount of funds that are available for a 2.5% multiplier, for medical, for retirees, for a spousal penalty removal, for actual reduction, for any of these major marquee benefits everybody's talked about here, 20-year retirement. All this stuff is so far beyond the amount of money we have, it's not even part of the conversation. So everybody understands that, correct?
That is correct. The board has priced all of those, and we worked with you on pricing, bringing current the pricing on almost all of the ones that you mentioned. The only pricing that hasn't been updated since the last time we did it is the retiree medical. But all of the benefits that you mentioned are in the billion plus, $1 billion to $3 billion price range, as opposed to $300 million. So you're right. $320 million will only go so far when you're talking about a improvement to a plan like Left Plan 2 that's got 18,000 active members and over 3,000 retirees.
I think the benefit improvement, I think, is a great idea. I think we need to go, when we're making recommendation to the legislator, I think that would be an interesting discussion at that time. I just there was an article that came out yesterday in the CNBC. The Seattle suburb where Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates both live is running out of money. I think, and the article is saying, well, that is the 6th richest zip code in the entire country, and it's running out of money. I think because of the tax or property tax financing in the state of Washington, the citizens will say, wow, my property tax goes up by this much or whatever. But because of the law, the cities or county or whatever property tax amount, dollar amount, can only go up by 1%. The economy has been doing really well. And that is why most of the employers are having trouble filling the position, because the same position that was filled for maybe 50,000 5 years ago, we're filling that same position, maybe about 75,000 today, plus the benefit. So 300 million may sound really big, but when you start tagging on some of these benefits, it doesn't take much to go fast. And I think as part of our educational process, we need to fully understand there's a cost that will go with each of this benefit. And unfortunately, we may not actually think through the total cost until we're already there. So I just want to throw that out for a little bit of a digestion for all of us, that some of these things are really the same citizens that we're trying to help with benefit improvement are the same ones that will pay for some of this, because we will keep on pushing sales tax, property tax, whatever tax to pay for this benefit. And we just need to keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Thanks. I just was kind of curious if there's been discussion or what the extent of kind of reaching out to members might be on this, and are we going to get some feedback? I happened to be at a Washington State Firefighters convention last week, and in talking to some of those members, hearing that it felt like their priority that I was hearing back was retiree medical. Not that it had to be a full benefit, but that we made some move in that direction. And so I guess I'd be kind of curious to know what that plan is for the next couple months as we're digging in a little deeper. Do we have an opportunity to get some feedback, and if so, what that might look like?
That's a great question, because there's two kind of historical perspectives that the board has had. One, with respect to benefit improvements, is a focus on the benefit improvements, since everybody's going to pay for it, that applies equally. So, for instance, retiree medical, the people that were talking to you are the people who don't have it. The people who already have it, they weren't talking to you. And so that's one of those benefits where a number of different locals have already bargained for some kind of benefit in that area. And so that's a type of benefit that wouldn't apply to all the members equally. To the extent that they all benefit in terms of a higher check, and they want to use some of that money in their check for retiree medical, that might be a backhanded way of getting at it. But medical could be, that would be one of the things that we could talk about, depending on which approach you go to, what would work. What would a partial medical benefit look like, for instance? The second piece has to do with reaching out to the members, and the board has discussed that issue almost going back to the very beginning. Historically, they have decided to reach out to the members or receive feedback from the members through the groups that represent those members. And that includes all of you on the board, the other organizations that represent law enforcement officers and firefighters. It becomes, when we did for instance, a couple of different presentations, like if you do a survey, for instance, what you tend to hear back is the people that have the strongest opinions are the ones that respond to the survey, and so you might only get Like if we were to use our newsletter as a survey, I think the estimate was we could expect 10% response. And so you might get the most vocal 6% outvoting the other vocal 4%, and what you end up with is a very vocal 6% kind of driving things. All of the organizations were designed to represent the members, and so the board has historically relied on them to do that. And then it forces members to use that process, and they end up doing a lot of the work then on behalf of the board in terms of filtering those things out. It's very difficult for you guys to do that in this process in the time frames that you have involved. So the board has never done any kind of benefits, like what's your most desired benefit improvement as far as a survey or anything like that. We did actually do some studying what types of surveys, if we were to do a randomized phone survey of active members, that was the one that I think ended up having the least bias in terms of being the most accurate. You got to be real careful about the questions, and then there was a cost associated with that as well. So at this point in time, we don't have anything in the plan for any kind of member survey regarding what their desires are for a benefit improvement. The plan is that they will voice those desires through their organization. And to the extent, for instance, it's challenging. It has only happened on extraordinarily rare occasions, but it's very challenging legislatively if the board makes a recommendation and then the organizations that support police officers and firefighters come in and say, well, we're opposed to that recommendation anyway. Then
that did just happen this session, by the way.
Yes, and it's happened once in the past as well, but it is very rare, and it's usually maybe just one of the many groups. All the groups don't always have agreement, but that's always the goal.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. Just one further comment.
Sure, please.
I just coming from the legislative perspective, I do appreciate, I'm in that role. I make the decisions for my 140,000 constituents every day. Senator Holy, I think, has that same feeling. I think it is helpful to take into account that this is kind of an extraordinary situation where there is money out for a benefit that is undefined at this time. Not saying that now is the time to go out, but making sure we have that pulse, and maybe we're good at that, but if we have the opportunity, I would think we might want to consider some kind of outreach, maybe not to every individual member, but to all the locals or whatever that might be, just to make sure we're on the right track. Not saying it's required, but having that voice might be helpful. And I did want to further comment, one of the members that was asking for that retiree medical benefit does have it in his contract. And what he was concerned about was that that's not guaranteed until he retires. And that could be bargained away. And so
Good point.
That's something just to think about.
Yeah. It was interesting. All the organizations are different, but for instance, at the state council convention, they've got all these committees with members from all the locals, and they actually discussed at least 3 different resolutions related to the benefit improvement account, and I think they ended up voting and adopting one. So the process is different, but that check back in terms of how does whatever come out of the board match up with the expectations of the organizations and the members they represent, that's a good caution.
Any other comments? Mark?
Just real Just real quickly, I don't think we should be in a hurry to spend the money in one way or another. I think I'm more interested in, from the board's perspective and from the organizations that represent all the members in Left 2 about maybe having a longer-term plan to, doesn't seem like the legislature is going to give the board the authority to move money from the pension fund to the benefit improvement account, even though it's our money. I get that. They want to have control over that. That would be my preference, but that doesn't seem to be necessarily realistic from the legislative standpoint. So in place of that, it might be well to consider in the future, not necessarily even for the next interim, but a long-term strategic plan in the future about how do we approach that issue of engaging the legislature to, from time to time, when it's appropriate and fiscally responsible, to move money from the fund to the benefit improvement account in order to accomplish the goals that we're talking about. And from my perspective, that's a long-term, should be a long-term strategic plan that the board is thinking about and that all the constituent groups should be thinking about, is how do we approach that in order to have a general benefit improvement, whatever that is, that's adequately funded somewhere in the future. So,
one issue that you will be working on this interim is that policy of, we've been calling it a funding policy, but for instance, how much reserve is reasonable? So you've had this historic, never before happened in the history of the markets, 10-year run-up that pushed the funded ratio of Left Plan 2 up to 109. And then there was a plan and a proposal that passed the legislature on how to spend some of that 109. One of the questions or some of the pushback on that proposal during the session was, what's reasonable? If the board decides that, no, for whatever reason, we need a 9% reserve, well then that would have argued against the proposal from last session. You'll end up working on that again this interim. And to the extent, whatever that answer is, and we took your feedback from last December, and we'll be working with the actuaries mathematically. What goals are you trying to accomplish with this reserve, and what then is a reasonable reserve? That may help frame those discussions. So if in the event that either this historic market run-up continues on for another extended period, or you have another kind of historic market run-up in the future, then you can say, well, we believe this reserve is reasonable, and we're beyond that. And we've got ideas, whether it's rate reductions or benefit improvements, on what to do with that reserve. That'll help frame those discussions with the legislature so they know what it is you're trying to accomplish and why. That was kind of one of the missing pieces, if you will, of that discussion last session. And to the extent it comes up again in the future, you'll have that filled in, that gap filled in.
Any other questions regarding this subject? A half hour? All right. Mr. Nelson, looks like you're still there.
All right.
Administrative update?
We've got a couple of different options that we could do right now. Lunch won't be ready for another half an hour, and typically I'll do my administrative update while you guys are eating so that you can kind of work and listen at the same time. We've got the budget preview up next, and rather than having your attention maybe be distracted while we're talking about the budget, maybe with your permission, we could move that item up next and then do lunch and the admin update after that.
Sounds good.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes good sense. I think The budget presentation scheduled for about a half hour. That should get us pretty close.
All right, with that then, I'll turn it over to Tim for that piece.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, for the record, Tim Valencia, Deputy Director for the Left 2 Board. This is the 2019-2021 budget preview. After the governor signs the operating budgets, state agencies such as us have a window in which we have to prepare a budget, and specifically our allotments, which really just means a spending plan, and provide that to the Office of Financial Management. In this case, the official deadline or final deadline is August 12th, but our internal deadline is trying to complete our work by the end of July. The budget process, this allotment process, is something that's described as intended to be something that provides transparency and accountability to ensure good use of government funds. So every agency provides their spending plan based on the numbers in their budget to OFM, which is then they track against your actual expenditures during the year. Now, our agency is, we'll call it, as we've discussed, in a little bit more unique position, being that we are not appropriated in the budget, but we are allotted, meaning we still have to provide that spending plan. For agencies that are appropriated out of the general fund, there's a much tighter scrutiny on their plans. So that may come into some of the discussions on this. So that with that background, that's intended to help you understand why we're going through this exercise and where we're headed with this, that ultimately we'll be providing a detailed plan to OFM about our your expected expenditures. So you do have a handout which details for each year of the fiscal year, and again, this budget will start this July 1 and go through June 30 of 2021. Here I've just aggregated on this slide into the full biennium. The expected spending for the next biennium for you to be able to conduct your business and meet your fiduciary obligations is just over $2.9 million. And you can see the different categories that I've kind of broken it out to. I will talk about a few of these to give you a little bit more depth on what's driving some of these cost factors and what may or may not be actually included. This is about a 16% increase in spending over the last biennium. We were approximately $2.5 million. The expenditure authority, which is the number that OFM brings back to us, is they say, here's what we expect you're going to spend based on what you had last year, changes that are going to occur in the state government, such as wage increases, central service charges, a variety of things that they need to adjust, and then any policy level items from the legislature all go into a number, and they come back to us with our expenditure authority, and that's what they're expecting that we're going to spend. In this particular case, the expenditure authority this year is about $2.6 million. So as you can see, this budget plan is over that expenditure authority. That's the first time we've actually had one where our initial proposal is higher than the expenditure authority. We've been able to live within those means in the past and have always tried to stay there, but with the discussions the board has had, and changes that we have going on, that our costs are a little bit higher this year. So looking at a couple of the items, the board had a lot of discussions starting last year around professional development and the training and education required for meeting fiduciary responsibility. That included both the team and for the trustees. So continuing on that, the assumptions that are built into the cost for professional development, we've maintained that elevated level of attendance at educational conferences and events. But there are some increased assumptions. We had some new trustees in the last couple of years, which are still having the opportunity to do some other initial training. We expect to have a new employer representative sometime in this biennium, which will then have some additional training. Those new trainings or new individual trainings, in addition to new team members, which of course once we replace Ryan, there will be somebody new. For example, one of the things we send them to is the CAP, the Certificate of Achievement in Public Pension Policy by the International Foundation. Attending that event tends to have more costs because it's a 4-day event, has a little bit higher registration fee than a conference. So there are some additional cost assumptions in there, and above just if we were in full capacity, we might have some additional, we have a few additional pieces assumed in there. Now, by comparison, this budget assumes attendance at 35 educational conferences or events between the team and the trustees. Last year, or in this last biennium, we actually experienced 30, but we had forecast 40 originally. So we have maintained more or less that same level of educational intent. You have said that you want to discuss the educational opportunities or options in the form of a policy at your October offsite meeting. So depending on where that discussion goes and what comes out of that, there may be cause to revisit what has been forecast for professional development. Oh, the other part of the assumptions that are changed in there, there are, we'll call it escalators with regards to certain pieces of the cost. So for travel to the conferences, every year there's always a slight escalation in the cost, so we've continued to try and forecast and escalate those costs. And at the same time, the registration fees for organizations, both for the conferences, have slowly been creeping up, and the membership fees in the national organizations like NCPERS and the International Foundation, those have been slowly creeping up over the years. So we have built in assumptions to accommodate what we expect to be future increases. So all of those wrapped together add about $30,000 additional cost into this budget compared to our spending plan last year. Regarding salary and budgets, this probably has one of the larger impacts in terms of the increase on spending. Of course, it does carry forward the salaries that we had from last year, so that's intended to infer that the salary increase that you passed for the director under the new legislation, that's built into the carry forward on the salaries and whatnot already. The operating budget did include general wage increases of 3% at July 1, 2019 and 3% at July 1, 20, and that's part of the money that was added in from the budget into our budget from the general fund. So that was incorporated, but those increases there. This budget, though, also has some opportunities or has some money built in for merit increases to be provided to staff. Now, specifically, that does not include any funding related to the executive director at this point, and there are some team members that we can't do any increases for because they're already at the maximum allowable salary for their bands under the state personnel system. So it's just, but at least there's an opportunity to be able to grant this. So we do have some funds built in for that. And then, of course, the staff vacancy. With Ryan leaving, and then we'll be hiring a new person. The assumption that we've made from a budgeting perspective is that we've budgeted at the top of the range for the senior research and policy manager. This creates a larger disparity only in that Ryan, in his younger career, was actually at a lower wage rate, so there's a gap there, but that's also part of the reason that he had left for a much higher paying job, so which is more industry, we'll call it relevant to that kind of role. So being mindful of that, we budgeted to be able to hire more appropriate and commensurate to that position, which is to say the same as what we already have Jacob working at, who's at a senior level. Now, we may not end up hiring somebody who's at a, experienced senior level. So the actual funding just will depend on who we actually hire and what their experience is commensurate to the pay. But from a budgeting standpoint, we've chosen to put it at the higher level just to be able to account for that possibility. As far as we're looking at that gap between what OFM expects us to spend and what we're presenting in this as a spending plan, this accounts the salary and benefit changes account for almost half of the difference between those two numbers. Contracts is another area that can have some we don't know what the final is going to be. They depends on need. So we've projected based on what we think is going or could be needed. The two things that are always in the contracts area are actuarial audit services and then legal services. Usually that's something like tax counsel with Ice Miller or something like that if they're consulting on a particular piece of legislation that you're considering. The actuarial audit services includes things such as the fiscal note audits by Marilyn Oliver, but it also includes money related to the actuarial valuation audit that's conducted through the Pension Funding Council. That includes the Left 2 board, and we've been included with the larger audit. That number is usually around $23,000 to $26,000. We're negotiating a new contract right now for the next couple of audits. We have money built in for that because it is something that has to be done. Fortunately, that has been paid for, though, out of funds available from what DRS has had since they have funded the larger audit, and they've been able to cover what includes the LEV expense. But if that doesn't continue, then we have money set aside for that. But that's a place where we have a variable look at the cost. So the cost may vary from what we've projected, but we've projected on the assumption that there will be fiscal notes to be audited and that there may be need for additional legal counsel. I will also point out that the built into the numbers that were presented to you is $50,000 for the tribal study. So that is built into this budget. And Steve's already talked some about the agency move. This is also going to be an area that has a lot of uncertainty with respects to the budget. Now, through this process that Steve was describing earlier that we have to go through with OFM and DES to get to where we get to seek out new accommodations, we've projected one-time moving costs of $151,000. That's just part of the process where they ask you to identify that, and then when you actually do move, they're going to check to see if you stuck within what you had forecast. We really have, this is a best guess because a lot of it's going to depend on what kind of facility we end up with and what things we need. This includes things like the moving costs, if we have to buy and build new cubicles in the space, if we have to do any renovations in the space, things that we need for IT. There's a whole host of things that can go into that number. So we've done our best to identify what we think are going to be costs that will be needed. Now, there are not any line items in the budget about those costs because right now they're just our best guess and with a lot of uncertainty there. So initially we would be absorbing any spending for the move through existing resources. But there is a agency move fund that exists, and agencies that experience moves like us can apply for reimbursement for those funds. So that's a process that we're looking into further. So that may be an available source of funding with regards to the one-time costs. There's also going to be unknown ongoing operational costs. Now, we are going to probably lose some co-location efficiencies, which may create additional costs. We've been fortunate to have the support of SIB's IT shop, so we may have to obtain additional help or purchase additional services from WATEC, which could increase costs. The use of the boardroom, as you discussed earlier. If we have to go to an off-site location, that could increase costs, particularly if we have to rent a space. And again, depending on what's in the new space. Now, this budget does include we kept in there the rent we've been paying, which actually is considered at the high end of the state real estate market and utilities costs. So there is money built in there for that part of it, but we don't know what those numbers are going to end up as. But we have at least accounted for some spending that may be ongoing, but we just don't know what the additional costs are going to be. So if in fact there are increased costs, I mean, whether it's the one-times or increased additional operating costs, such as if we have to hire IT help, then that may be something that may go into a potential decision package to be able to increase the ongoing budget for the board. So at this point, that's the thick of the budget and some of the core spending items. I'll invite the director to share any comments that he would like to with regards to the budget.
So Tim's kind of given you the overview of how this will work. Right now, the expected costs, if everything goes out, they would exceed the expenditure authority. So that's something then that we've talked about with the board in the past. There are ways that we could reduce these costs to stay within the expenditure authority, and we would, we can talk about those options with you. For instance, leaving positions vacant. Some of these savings may or may not materialize over time, but this is our professional estimate of what we will need to accomplish support your fiduciary duties this upcoming biennium. Tim mentioned the biggest piece has to do with the vacant position, and particularly the point he made that in a competitive market, if you're not paying a competitive salary, then we lost Ryan, partly because I couldn't. Even if I had wanted to, I couldn't match the salary that was being offered under state guidelines. You can only give a certain raise amount per year. That bringing in somebody like we did with Ryan, bringing in somebody at the beginning of their career is a possibility, and that would increase or that would result in some savings. But Ade mentioned it earlier as well. The hiring market today is very different than it was 5 years ago. We were extraordinarily fortunate. Ryan was very capable, and he hit the ground running, and he got better real fast, and he was worth way more than what we were paying him and what we could pay him when he left. And that's the challenge when you've got people like that. Then if you're limited on what you're willing to pay them or what you can pay them, then it's very hard to keep them. I'm in the process now of kind of reaching out and talking to some people who might be interested in the vacant position, but none of them fit into the category of Ryan, where they're, when he started, he was still in college and was working as an intern, and then starting out kind of at the beginning. There's no way to bring in anybody with any kind of experience or in pensions or in the state government at the salary that we had with Ryan. So there's going to be some kind of increased cost there. And then the only way to manage that and stay within the expenditure would be to leave the position vacant for an extended period of time then. So you could kind of make up for it. That we can talk about. The rest of the process, again, some of this we're not going to know until after the move. So you'll be adopting the budget next month. So to the extent you have questions between now and next month, you can reach out to me or Tim. And then after adoption, the plan is once we get through the move and we have a better idea of where we landed, what efficiencies we may or may not have lost, where we're at, then we'll bring back potentially both to the legislature some budget packages next session, and to you some potential proposals for how to adjust to the new location, the new reality. For instance, do we need to add another person to the team, and how much will that cost? Those are the kind of things that we're not going to know until after the move.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chair. The very humble nature of Mr. Nelson and Mr. Valencia strikes me when we're talking about an operating overhead of significantly less than 3/10,000ths of 1% of our trust fund. 3/10,000ths of 1% of our trust fund for operating expenses here. It makes me smile. So no apologetics needed. You guys run a tight ship. Question. To allow flexibility, maybe in this type of market, in order to keep employees in private industry out there, it's a well-known, attribute that some of the most significant cost to an organization over a period of time are employee attrition, because of the productivity, the efficiencies, the institutional knowledge that goes away here, and the loss of productivity and a run-up on somebody like that. In order to maintain, we fought the same fight keeping you here, just recently on this. Is this something that would be properly addressed through a policy discussion with OSA? Is it a legislative fix that maybe Representative Berquist and I could explore? What do we need to do to address this from a state agency that's a little bit different than everybody else under SCPP?
It's a good point. We are a state agency, and so we operate within the boundaries and guidelines of all other state agencies. One of the challenges in Washington, compared to what other states that you might be familiar with now from your training as well, is in other states, pension organizations, there is a premium paid for pension experience and pension expertise. And that type of premium, you'll see it recognized in certain areas here in Washington, for instance, with the State Investment Board. The skills that they bring are recognized, and that is seen as a competitive nationwide market that our SIB is competing in. But in Washington, for instance, the director of the Department of Retirement Systems is not treated any differently from the director of any other state agency, even though they sit on the State Investment Board and they're the chair of the Select Committee on Pension Policy on occasions, chair of the Pension Funding Council. And as a result, for instance, Marcy Frost left to become the director of CalPERS. We've got, last count, I think we had 6 Washington employees, former Washington employees, who are the directors of other pension agencies around the country. And it won't be 7, because I'm not going anywhere, I'm telling you that. But that is a recognition of, and it does trickle down into my business as well, because as I'm competing, the best kind of comparison in my mind for the types of people I'm competing with is the legislative, the policy analysts and the attorneys that work for the legislature. The work that they do is very similar. Their pay structure, though, is different from what the executive branch does through there. And so we're kind of always wiggling in and around there, and I have been extraordinarily fortunate. I've hired some great people over the years, and so we've always got more bang for our buck that way. But Ryan, I would have matched what Ryan was offered or more to keep him, and it would have been better for the agency, but I couldn't. And it's a great opportunity for Ryan, and at some point in time, he's going to get that experience, and he may end up coming back. to work for the legislature, or he may come back to work in Washington, and then in that new role be paid commensurate with what he's actually delivering. One thing, every now and then I try to sneak this in discussions with OFM. It usually doesn't go anywhere, but when the board was first created, and there was a fiscal note done, because that was the first year that fiscal notes were done on initiatives, the fiscal note that was done for the Left 2 board estimated that it would take 16 employees to do the work that the board needed to do. And so we have run very effectively and very efficiently over the years. We're at 7 now. We may end up having to adjust that up. I don't think the quality of the services that we've been provided has diminished. We've been smart about using contracting for services like actuarial services. You get great actuarial services without having an actuary on the staff. We've used state agency programs that are there for small agencies for things like accounting and different types of functions that have kept us from having to use all of those 16 FTEs and kept the cost much lower. Never get that they don't give credit though for that kind of stuff when you're talking to them about improvements. But I do believe that the board has a good story to tell, and historically, it may not have always been easy, but we've always received the support that we've needed, either from the legislature or from OFM as we've been doing our business. So,
If I misspoke before and said OSA, I didn't mean to scare Lisa. OFM is where I was going with that. Where do we start the conversation?
well, part of it'll be with you. Well, that's why we're bringing it up today. Part of it'll be with you guys in July. You guys will decide what it is that you need, and whether or not you're willing to have that discussion with OFM about how you're going to meet your fiduciary obligations, and that then some of that will involve the processes like us going through submitting our agency budget, talking with our budget analysts, answering questions, going through that back and forth. Some of it may also involve discussions with OFM. I know in the past the chair has talked with OFM. I know during session you and Representative Berquist had a number of discussions, and so part of where it goes depends on what the answers we get to some of the initial. If they've got questions about, is that reasonable? What about this? That's the kind of back and forth that Tim and I will take care of. If they've got questions like, we don't care whether it's reasonable or not, we're not going to approve it, well, then that's the kind of questions then where you guys will be more likely to be involved in.
Anything else on this? Steve?
Do you have a preferred timeline on replacement for the open position?
Well, based on, like, for instance, today, where Tim and I are doing all the presentations, I'd like to do it as soon as possible. That may be tricky to the extent if you guys are uncomfortable with me filling a spot that quickly. Jacob's very high capability, and he'll be doing most of the presentations in July, so you don't have to worry about hearing me do all of them 2 months in a row. I don't want to scare you guys away from coming back in July. But yes, it does. Tim and I both had to spend a lot of time for this meeting. Jacob helped prepare a lot of the materials ahead of time, so I don't want to minimize that. But it does have an impact when we're short. And one of the things we did do, I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit to my admin update, but to help Jacob out also is we did bring on a temporary part-time research analyst, Chantel Wan. If you want to stand up, Chantel, she'll be here with us. She's currently at Western Washington, and she'll be with us through the summer, and she's helping out Jacob with some of the projects that he's currently involved on. And she's only been here a week, and she's already been doing a great job. So that'll help out a little bit in terms of making Jacob more effective. But even a more effective Jacob can't reasonably expect it to do the job of both analyst spots. So until it's filled, that's going to fall on me and Tim to some extent. And right now, with just the regular duties, and then you put the move on top of that, we're stretched. So my preference would be to
Well, like before the end of the summer, you would hope, in a perfect world, you'd have.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I've got, for instance, I don't know what my budget constraints necessarily are right now until I had a chance to talk with you first. In a perfect world, I'd be making an offer to somebody this month. There are extremely capable people out there who are interested in coming to work here. But right now, I can't do it because I don't know what I can even offer them.
Is that something that we can help with this time around rather than waiting till next month?
No, you could, yes, to the extent that, and we've got, if we could always adjust down the road. So I could bring somebody on, and then budget-wise, if that ends up being unsustainable, then we could reevaluate that. That might be part of the budget packages. So for instance, if we do budget requests next session and they're not approved, then we'd have to discuss on what do we do moving forward. But I'm comfortable moving forward, not letting this discussion slow down the hiring process and moving forward on that. I just wanted a chance to talk with you guys about it ahead of time to make sure that you're comfortable with that as well.
Would we need to make any motion? Doesn't sound like it.
No, you don't
Okay.
need a motion, but if you're going to fire me, let me know before I do it. Is kind of where we're at.
We are meeting executive session, so, right?
Yeah, you do have some
For
time if you
personnel
want to.
evaluation.
If you've got some time scheduled this afternoon, yeah, if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Just make sure we understand this right then. So you are in the process of looking.
Yes,
You have a salary range that
Yes.
you're looking at, and you can get that done potentially before our July meeting. Potentially.
but potentially, yeah,
And then we come back in July and there's a budget adoption.
yes.
Okay.
A day?
But can we do it side by side? I think there's a suggestion that we may want to meet with the OFM, trying to push for some of these changes. So instead of waiting to do that after the hiring or after the budget, maybe we can move these things along side by side to be able to get to the end road quickly. That may be something that.
Again, can you touch on the budget we adopt in July? Is it August or September that the budgets are finalized or presented?
You'll adopt it in July, and then so there's like two side-by-side processes. There's the budget that you're adopting and that we're talking with you about, and then there's the whole OFM budget process where we take those numbers and we put them into OFM's system.
Okay.
That process will go on. I don't think that's finalized until sometime in August. They're supposed to be entered in at some point in time in July.
August 12th is actually the final deadline for agencies to turn in their allotment plans to OFM.
Yeah, so that'll be, that's kind of part of the side-by-side. Separate and apart from that, we're going to have some moving pieces like the move cost. That'll be, the hope is that we get through the move and that by next January, we know where we've landed and what we need and what needs to be changed, and we can talk with you about that in more specifics. That's the hope. Otherwise, we'll end up moving during session, and then I'll be living out of my car, and that'll be...
Literally.
Yeah.
Anything on this? Right, so
All right.
we are at 11:30.
Yeah, and
another
and
lunch
I
is-
am informed lunch is ready.
So we will take, let's take about 15 minutes, grab our lunch, come back, and at 11:45, we'll put you on. Does that work?
That works.
Okay. We'll go ahead and get started. Gavel down. Yeah, I know. All right, Mr. Nelson, you're back on the clock.
All right. So, we're backing up on the agenda, and we're going to the administrative update. Just out of reference for some of you, like Mark, who's been here from the beginning, July 1 is the 16th anniversary of the effective date of the Left 2 board. And yeah, Mark's the last of the original board members. He's been serving all 16 of those years. He's been serving longer than I have. So I wanted to mention that. Already talked about the agency move and already introduced Chantal. She'll be here through towards the end of September when she heads back to school. And we had 3 trustee appointments that were up this year. All 3 of the incumbent trustees have been reappointed. And so that was Mark, Tarina, and Pat. And so your new terms go through 2025. So another 6 years for all of you.
Is there any way to change my vote on that one? I didn't know Pat was for 6 more years.
It's a governor appointment. You didn't get a vote on that.
Well, I always have a vote, you know. Just, may not count for anything. I know.
And then I mentioned last month we were in the process of responding to a public records request from Phil Talmadge, and that request has been completed, I believe. There may be, our piece of it is being done. There might be a few other documents that were being reviewed by the AG, but that, for our work on it, is completed. With respect to outreach activities, the Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs had their expo in May, and Tammy was there. Tim has been at a couple of the different locals. They've been doing benefit fairs, and that's something that's becoming more common now, where different locals, either police or fire, but at least initially it's been more fire, will have a day where they bring in representatives from all the different, whether it's their insurance, their deferred comp providers, DRS, the Left 2 board, all there at the same time to make presentations and answer questions. And those have been so well received. More and more locals are starting to do those. And then last week, the State Council of Firefighters had their annual convention. We had a table there, and I was there with both Tim and Tammy. Upcoming in the near future, but not Walk-Ups, I think, is the next one that has their annual conference scheduled, but that's not before our July meeting. But between now and July, I don't think we have any other outreach that's coming to mind. Our next meeting is July 24th. And again, you'll be taking action and making adoption there. So as Jesse reaches out to you to find out whether you'll be attending that meeting, please be responsive so that we can plan, particularly if it looks like we're not going to have a quorum, then we're really going to have to make some moves, because that'll be probably, that meeting in December are probably the two, and maybe October, the most important meetings of the year in terms of action items. All right. Following up on that, one of the things that we do every year is I go out and I'll meet with each of you individually to talk about your expectations from the team, your expectations from me. Those are one-on-one, or we can have somebody else there if you want, but it's intended to give you a chance to candidly discuss how things are going and provide feedback on that, and then we roll up that feedback and report back to you in October. Immediately after this meeting, so in the next day or two, you'll start hearing from Jesse and Jessica, maybe from Tim, with the survey questions that we send out to you ahead of time for your scoring for those. And then also this year, in preparation for that discussion about training, I want to be able to talk with each of you about what your training objectives are. And so you'll be getting some options and then also some information about like what you've done. So, it'll be a different answer for each of you. So Jessica's in working out for each of you. Here's what you've done. Here's what's coming up that might seem reasonable. And then also that's something I want to be able to talk with you about when we meet. And Jesse's going to start scheduling those as soon as possible to get going on that. With that, Mr. Chair, I think like I said, a lot of these items we've talked about earlier. That ends my administrative update, but I would be happy to answer any questions.
Questions for Steve? I'd like to thank you and Tim and Tammy for attending the State Council, our convention. Having the three of you there, bouncing in and out, I think very helpful to our membership. I think they like to see you there. I know they always got lots of questions, and just having you as a resource is greatly appreciated as well. So thank you very much. And then at NC PERS, thanks for the tutorial on some of the things we were talking about. I helped with that. You provide good guidance. I was asking Pat, they didn't work so well, so I turned to you. So.
Is this what?
Yes, sir.
Nothing but love for you, buddy.
I'll put a tie on.
That's what have you.
We'll have a tie.
Nothing but love. You know that.
Well,
Anything else for Steve on that one, that issue?
all right.
Interruptive?
Next up then, yes, another presentation, interrupted military service. So all the plans have a benefit regarding military service. If you are called up to serve in the military while you're a police officer or firefighter, when you return to employment, you can get service credit for all that time that you were gone. And right now, the dividing line is if that service credit meets certain criteria, you actually get it for free. So if you're, for instance, if you're called up and you're sent into combat, you get that service credit for free. If you're called up, but you are not sent into combat, or you're sent in, maybe you're called up and you're sent to the Pentagon, you still get credit for that time when you come back. You just have to pay the contributions that you would have paid into LEF if you've been working at your regular job during that time. So you still get the service credit, but you do have to pay the contributions. Now, the state law that distinguishes between sort of the combat and the non-combat service is a direct copy of the federal law. And the federal law went through a total overhaul here recently. And I love the language because the justification for the total overhaul was that the current processes or the current definitions were inconsistent and confusing. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly right, because we've been living with that same thing here in Washington. So you would have questions where what seemed very arbitrary differences in types of service were having a big difference in people's benefits. So with that new overhaul, though, because we completely copied the federal language, now our state language is out of date. So there are members who would otherwise be entitled to receive service credit free of charge who won't until the current law gets changed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what those differences are and some other ideas for the change here coming up. So, again, I mentioned everyone is entitled to get service credit. The only difference is whether or not the member has to pay their contributions or not. They don't have to pay interest on their contributions, so to some extent it's partially subsidized by the fund. When the member pays their share, the state and the employer get billed for their share as well. But all members, regardless of their type of service, currently, all members can get service credit for military duty. Now, the no-cost piece is the one that comes up, and that's where most of the questions arise. That current definition, the one I said matches the federal definition, is in a different section of RCW than most of the stuff we're looking at. It's in 4104, and it applies to all the plans, not just Left Plan 2. And what they do is they define veteran, and they define veteran in terms of combat, which creates a lot of confusion because there are a number of other, you can be a veteran and not be in combat within typical meaning of the word veteran. So this is sort of a specialized definition that doesn't match up with the real world definition of the word. And it is, because it's in this piece of statute too, what ends up happening is it gets referenced, I'll talk about this later, gets referenced by a lot of other benefits. And so there are kind of two definitions now of veteran. This one that's combat and the other one that's broader and includes all veterans. The way the federal government distinguishes between combat and non-combat is the type of medal that they give you for your service. And these definitions come from the Department of Justice. So a campaign medal recognizes deployment in a large scale or long duration combat. Expeditionary medals, you still might, for instance, you might be in combat, and that's where some of the confusion comes up, but it's in a small scale or a short duration combat, and or maybe you're sent to an area where, like UN peacekeeping forces, where there isn't conflict right now, but you're in the middle of two different groups who are looking to go at each other, and so it's certainly not, for instance, it's not being stationed at the Pentagon or being stationed at Fort Lewis. There is at least the threat of imminent hostility present with that type of service. Those types of service, though, the federal government grants an expeditionary medal. And so under state law and under Left 2 pension law, what that means then is you can get the service, but you have to pay the contributions for it. Now, part of the confusion has been all of those campaigns, like here it talks about large scale, large duration combat operations or short duration, they all sound exactly alike. So you'll get, somebody who's in Operation Noble Eagle and they are getting free service credit, and somebody who is in Operation, Imminent Peril or something like that doesn't. And they're like, well, why does it seems arbitrary based on the past naming conventions that were used by the Department of Justice. They all tended to sound alike. There are some other service medals that the Department of Justice awards. They also do not qualify for the free military service, and I mainly put them in here. They're in the report as well for purposes of thoroughness. Where most of the discussion comes up is between these campaign and the expeditionary metals. Discussion and confusion comes up. So here is an example of a number. This is in the new naming conventions. What they did is they created a number of different campaigns that didn't exist before. And so under for instance, the Kosovo campaign medal did not exist until this new change. So anybody who has a Kosovo campaign medal, and there are a number of different operations underneath that campaign that could qualify for a campaign medal, none of them would currently be receiving free service credit or eligible under the existing law. So that's an example of how this naming convention has created gaps now in the current law of who's covered and for free service or not. Some of the other, like they would used to call it Gulf War I and Gulf War II, and now all of that is rolled up under the Afghanistan or Iraq campaign medals, and those now are listed as conflicts which could qualify for that. So you can see here the types of the new campaigns and the new expeditionary. The one in particular of the expeditionary medals that I want to mention to you today is the Global War on Terrorism. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when I talk about expeditionary medals. But the qualifications for that expeditionary medal are different from what we're from other medals, and so that may create an issue as we talk about whether or not to expand the coverage. So for instance, this in the 2018 legislation that you guys did, you were consistent with the pre-existing policy. You added a couple of campaigns, clarified some stuff that was unclear in the existing statute. It wasn't just a technical correction because this did apply to members' benefits, but it was in that nature. It was consistent with that ongoing decision that had been there from the beginning to separate between combat and non-combat. But when that legislation was being considered in 2018, there was a lot of questions from legislators and from members about different types of expeditionary campaigns and why are they or are they not included. And again, that's where that kind of arbitrary naming convention came out. There were over 30-some, at that time, there were over 30-some different campaigns or conflicts that could qualify for an expeditionary medal. And so part of the concern was, well, if you add in this particular one, how do you then not go in, or how do you justify leaving out the other 30 and perhaps creating this piece where one gets added in and then all of a sudden now you've got piecemeal legislation every session adding in additional expeditionary medal type awards. Since that time, there has been not only the renaming, the new convention that's been adopted by the naming stuff, but there's also different conflicts that have continued on that are combat conflicts that do qualify for campaign medals. So even under the pre-existing policy, there would still be the need for another kind of technical correction, if you will. But by creating this higher level more consistent naming convention, the Department of Justice has resulted in a lot of potential changes. One of the other things that they also did when they did the naming changes, they published and they reached out to all the veteran organizations to reach out to veterans and say, hey, if you were in a conflict that you think does qualify for a campaign medal, but you didn't get one before, you can reapply and get a campaign medal now if you do meet the qualifications. So for instance, originally none of the campaigns that were associated with Kosovo qualified for, were considered combat or qualified for a campaign medal. Now, that not only is there the Kosovo campaign medal, but there's 11 underlying campaigns, and some of the ones that we heard about in 2018 were some of those campaigns associated, or operations or missions associated with the Kosovo campaign. One of the new ones is Operation New Dawn, which is eligible for the Iraq campaign medal. Now, the degree of personal risk is what the Department of Justice uses as the distinguishment between what's a campaign medal and what is a expeditionary medal. And again, that still can feel very arbitrary to someone who is being shot at, but in a short duration campaign. So that's just what they were trying to get at, is the degree of personal risk as opposed to how long the campaign was. So now, even if somebody was only shooting at you for a couple weeks, you could still qualify for a combat medal associated with that campaign. This change kind of brings up a couple of different policy issues. In addition to just the technical changes that are going to be required to maintain the current policy, there are two new policy issues that I wanted to bring to your attention. One is the way the statute has been written. It's designed to come back every time there's a change, you need to update the statute. And since the beginning of the Gulf Wars, there have been a number of now military campaigns. So there's been changes, if not quite every year, at least so regularly that it would require almost constant maintenance of a statute. So one of the policy considerations that we will bring back to you is changing the way the statute is written, so now that it would match the new federal guideline, but it would be more generic in the sense of, if you get a campaign medal, you qualify for free military service. And if you don't, you still get service, but you have to pay for it. That then would not require the same constant update. To the extent that the military adds new campaigns every year, the decision piece was already made. So there's that question of the general of restructuring. That's almost a technical piece. But then the two policy pieces, though, that's going to bring up is, one, this question about expeditionary metals is going to come up again. It's possible that the new naming conventions and the new information that's gone out from the Department of Justice has dealt with some of the issues in the past where somebody felt like I was getting shot at, so it should be considered a combat operation. But at the same point in time, there are members who get called up, and even though their service isn't combat, it does create significant personal hardships for them. So for instance, they might be stationed in Guantanamo. Nobody's shooting at them, but they're away from their family. They're away from their job. They're getting paid their military call-up pay, which for most law enforcement officers and firefighters is significantly less than their left salary is. So telling them, hey, when you come back, you have to pay the contributions that you would have had to pay based on your left salary can create a financial hardship for them. And the naming convention changes doesn't deal with that issue at all. So there will still be some questions around expeditionary call-up. To that extent, and this is just a preview, that's where that global war on terror expeditionary medal comes up. Almost everybody who has served in the military since September 11th, 2011 can qualify for the Global War on Terror Expeditionary Medal. So to the extent that there is going to be discussion about expanding the free service credit beyond campaign medals and into expeditionary medals, that then is something that you'll have to wrestle with, because essentially everybody who's served since 2011 would probably be getting their service for free. We'll be looking at what the costs of that and so forth in future presentations. Jacob will be doing that in future presentations. The other issue that we're we want to talk to you about, as I mentioned earlier, this is in 4104. It's in a statute that is referenced by a lot of other things besides pensions. And so one of the complications would come up is somebody would come in and say, well, we'd like this benefit for veterans. It might be something as innocuous as license plates, or it might be financial, such as some kind of property tax break. And they all reference the same statute. So it's like, oh, okay, but if by expanding the number of people, now you're impacting Left 2 as well. This statute is referenced not just by Left 2, but by all the other pension plans. So one of the other issues that we're going to explore with you is the feasibility of just coming up with a separate definition that only applies for pensions. So that way, at least some of these crossover issues, those would be eliminated. Nobody's going to be going into, say, the DRS statutes to change the definition of veteran to include more a different type of license plate or something along that line for veterans. And that will keep the policy discussions around definition of veteran cleaner with respect to pensions in the future. So that's sort of the preview of coming attractions. One, a more generic definition that won't require, hopefully, constant maintenance. Two, moving that definition into the pension statutes so we can avoid some of the crossover. And then that larger issue of what is the appropriate boundary point for free service credit? Should it remain where it is, or should it be expanded? Those will be the policy issues that we'll be working on with you on throughout the rest of the interim. I'd be happy to answer any questions on this now, but the intent was to give you the general overview of what this issue is and our plan for working on it with you this interim.
That's good. So looking at our interim plan, that would be September for our comprehensive
Yes.
report. Okay.
And then we'd have November for a possible comprehensive follow-up if you're not ready to go straight to legislation, and December for legislation. We'd also though, this would be one that we'd be reaching out to the Select Committee on Pension
Specifically, yeah.
Policy on and trying to coordinate with them. So depending on the timing of their meetings, we might end up adjusting some of this to make it work for both organizations.
Questions for Steve? Mr. Nelson?
All right.
Number 8.
Number 8, agenda items for future meetings. So if you look on the draft interim work plan handout, for July, you'll be adopting supplemental rates or not. You'll be making that decision. You're going to have a couple of presentations from the state actuary. One is on new risk measures. That's Actuarial Standards of Practice 51. You'll see it on the notes there as ASOP 51. I'm reminded today by the chair to stop using acronyms that are not immediately that makes sense to you guys right off, and that's a perfect example. So that new risk measures, that's a presentation from the actuary's office. And then there'll be a first presentation from the actuary's office also on your funding methods, the discussion of your funding method, and sort of aside from that, then Jacob's going to be doing month of death. I'm saying that because he's not here, which you've heard before, and he'll be doing survivor option election, which you've heard before. And these will be the initial presentations. It's just kind of a reminder. Maybe we'll have a new board member by that time or not, but it's a reminder of what those issues are and of plans for moving forward. Jacob will also give you kind of an overview of the tribal participation in LEF study that was assigned. And I'll be doing a next step in the benefit improvement account discussion. That's what we currently have on the agenda for July 24th.
Do we need to add the budget adoption to that?
Yes, you do. I apologize for that.
Anything else for Steve on July's meeting?
One thing.
Yes, sir.
Steve, on the survivor option election, I think at the last couple of times we've talked, one of the things that I don't want to say there's consensus, but I'm hoping to maybe get there at that meeting, was that we're looking at the Oregon plan,
Right.
which is I think it's a 60-day option.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if that's where we want to focus in, but maybe
Yeah,
through the
there were-
discussion we've had, that seems to be where we're going.
Okay.
If that's what,
There were two different possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
One is a window from your initial hire, and we do have some feedback from Oregon about their experience operating that window. Their 60-day window, they say it's very rare that members change.
Okay.
And so that might help. Their experience might help reassure the Department of Retirement Systems that this isn't going to be a big workload increase for them. The other piece that we were considering is if there is a change in your benefit after you retire, the result of a contract or audit or something along that line, in a very limited number of cases we saw from the data, your pension benefit could change by 5 or 10% or more. And so then the second possibility was, do you want to give the member a new opportunity with respect to their survivor benefit election when you have that kind of triggering event?
this is only me, but I'm just looking for baby steps, and what's the easiest one to move forward on to give the member an option. And right now we have no way of making options except for technical issues, and this would be, if the cost is not that big and it's easily readable, that getting it through the legislature might be the best, and through DRS. So, but I
Yeah.
think both would be good, but I'm glad you're focusing on both.
Yeah, and we're reaching out again. That one could apply to all the plans, so we're reaching out to the select committee to see if they're interested in engaging on that topic this interim as well.
Anything on our agenda for our July meeting? Mr. Nelson?
Right.
Right. Possible exec session?
Yeah, that concludes all of the regularly scheduled business for the board. We weren't sure whether you wanted to have exec session or not. We did arrange to have the small conference room available. So to the extent if that is something that you wanted to do right now, then you just need to let the public know how long you're scheduled or estimating that you'll be out.
I think we've covered our items. Tor's not in attendance as well. Unless I'm missing something, I'm not sure why we...
All right.
You got to give me a wink or something? I mean,
No.
Okay.
No.
Make sure. I mean, you covered the budget, which we talked about, the evaluations you covered, coming out with that survey, and then the policy updates, which I see you're going to be down here. It's going to be in our October meeting, so.
Yeah. Apparently you're not going to fire me, so that's good.
Oh, yeah, we do need to meet.
That was the only other thing that you mentioned, Mr. Chair, as a possibility, yeah.
I wouldn't mention that. Not out loud. All right. Is there any other business to come before our board today? All right. We will be adjourned till July.